I don't know, people seem willing coherence. I talked about that in this book. That's on my website. My website goes on research. You'll be able to remember it. Just research. Thank you.
Russell Targ is a physicist, author, ESP researcher, and pioneer in the development of the laser. Mr. Targ co-founded a 23-year program of research into remote viewing at Stanford Research Institute for the C.I.A. He writes about these experiences in his latest book, Do You See What I See? Memoirs of a Blind Biker. He gave a talk recently about these experiences at East West Books in Mountain View, California.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming here on such a warm evening in Mountain View. Very happy to be here. The last time I was here was about a year and a half ago. I had a book called The End of Suffering, which was the Buddhist perspective on peacefulness in unpeaceful times, or how to get out of hell free. And the teaching, as many of you know, the teaching of Buddhism is the reason we suffer is that we spend a lot of time defending the story of who we think we are. And the Buddhist teaching is that there is no self. The self is just a story that we tell. It's a business card that we carry with us. And we create a lot of suffering for ourselves by defending that story, which is just something we made up. And I believe that that's all true. So about a year ago, I went to my publisher, Hampton Roads, and said, I have a lot of stories that I've been telling, and people say, can't you tell me more about that? Can't you tell us what really happened? And I went to Jack Jennings at Hampton Roads and said, I think I'd like to write my autobiography. And he said, I thought the last book you wrote said that there is no self. That sounds like it's going to be a very short book. And I said, well, there is no self, it's just a story, and I want a chance to tell that story. So that's really what I'm here to do now, to talk about some of the adventures we had with the C.I.A. and remote viewing, and other adventures I had in the course of my life in Palo Alto and my time in Silicon Valley. One of the things that I want to do is to encourage you all, one of the reasons that I wrote the book is to encourage you all to get in touch with the part of yourself that's psychic. It's something that's available to all of us. And I'll talk about that as well. And about half past the hour, I'll answer questions on anything that you want to know about that I didn't reveal. The first thing to reveal are the shameful facts of my birth. There are many people, and the truth of that is that there are many people here whom I know and who know me, and I shake hands and say, I'm really happy to see you, and I don't recognize them. And I realized one day I was walking down Castro Street, and I walked right by my son. And I had always known that because of my very bad vision, I didn't recognize people. And I thought that was a consequence of having bad vision. But when I didn't recognize my tall, handsome son, now it's guilty with an explanation, because he was wearing his scrubs. So he walked by me like the Jolly Green Giant in his green pajamas. But I probably should have recognized him anyway. And I became interested in what bad vision has to do with not recognizing people. And the answer is, bad vision has nothing to do with not recognizing people. There is a problem called face blindness, called prosperagnosia, for those of you who are interested in that kind of thing. And there's a whole little community on the internet that's suffering from face blindness, and they have normal vision. And these are people who have either been hit in the head or had a stroke, or like me, had some developmental problem. And for most of these face-blind people, they don't have any vision problem at all. They drive cars, they see things clearly, they simply don't recognize faces. And this is a new hot area of cognitive sciences, because the government and the computer industry is very interested these days in face recognition software, electronics. Can you put up a camera to say, there goes Mary Jane, tell the government she's on the loose again? And that kind of thing is very extensively done in England. It's becoming more so, and as Palo Alto is putting up cameras all over the place. And these touching face-blind websites are really very interesting in that there are people who are sort of more perplexed about being face-blind than I am. Because I'm accustomed to living in a kind of French Impressionist world. As my wife always tells me that everybody looks nicer to me than they really are because I don't see the imperfections. So it's not so bad. I learned to live with that. But I along with my new little cohort, don't recognize a lot of people. I was going to say it's a whole little guppy world of face-blind people. What I mean by that, it's a nice construct. Many years ago, I had a girlfriend in New York. I was a graduate student. She was an art student, had a beautiful apartment in Greenwich Village. I talk about her in my book. I talk about a lot of girlfriends. This one was an art student at the Art Students League and raised guppies in a big tank in her living room in the village. And I invited her out one weekend. She said, no, I can't do that. We have a international guppy show at the Armory, and I have to sleep at the Armory this weekend. I said, well, why do you have to sleep at the, what's that all about? And she said, well, in my big tank that I'm bringing to the Armory, there are a lot of pregnant guppies, and I have to sleep next to my tank, or people will steal my pregnant guppies. And I think of this as a kind of metaphor for little subgroups like face-blind people who now have dozens of websites on the internet. I think of this as one little guppy world, like the guppy world is interested in ESP, and the whole rest of the world doesn't know anything about them and doesn't believe they exist. So it was this little guppy world of face-blind people that I stumbled into when I went to the internet, and they have very interesting pictures. They talk about recognizing faces or like recognizing stones to them. They have to get clues. And ideally, if you're going to have a friend, friend should have long hair, and red hair is good too, so you can find them in the crowd. Otherwise, as far as I'm concerned, people look very nice. They're not out of focus. None of you are out of focus. They're sort of regular, good-looking people. 2 eyes, a nose, 2 ears. What more is there to say? So that's something I've been dealing with, and it really was not until I started writing this book that I came in contact with this whole interesting world of face blindness, which is unrelated to bad vision. And that's a big surprise. So I just thought I would tell you that I'm not being rude when I don't say, hi Joe, I'm really glad to see you. I am glad to see you, but there's no chance that I'm going to recognize you, because that's just the way it's part of suffering, you see. People are very attached to the way they look. And one of the things that we know is that if you think that who you are is what you see in the mirror in the morning, you're definitely in for a lot of suffering. So that's the first step in recognizing that you're not a body. Now, I think I'll tell you a little bit about the remote viewing, which is how this all got started. The clue that you're not a body, my clue that I'm not a body, comes from the decade I spent at SRI teaching people to do remote viewing. And teaching remote viewing is what I'm more or less retired from honest labor for the past decade. I've been writing books and teaching remote viewing. And it turns out teaching people to be psychic is much easier than building lasers or measuring wind shear, because we all have the ability to quiet our minds and look into the distance and look into the future. Now that seems very impossible or crazy or unlikely, but it's very easy. For example, if you go to the internet now, the American Institute of Physics still doesn't know about remote viewing, but if you go to the internet and search for remote viewing, you will, in quotation marks, so if you find out how many pages are there devoted to remote viewing, we have a pool right now, like counting jelly beans, but you won't guess. There's more than 1 million sites dealing with remote viewing, which I found astonishing, since in 1972, when we started remote viewing, there were no sites. Of course, there was also no internet. So. But what happened is that in 1972, Hal Puthoff and I, two laser physicists, decided that we wanted to start a ESP research program at a genuine, well-supported government laboratory. And because we both had credentials for having done something real for the previous decade, we were able to attract considerable amount of government money from many, many different agencies, from CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, Army Intelligence, NASA, almost everyone you can think of was eventually willing to support our program. And in the beginning, Ingo Swann, who's a New York artist, taught Hal and me how to do remote viewing. And remote viewing is basically quieting your mind with the recognition that you cannot name things or grasp onto them. So that if your idea is that a good test for psychic ability is to read the serial number off the dollar bill in my pocket, then you're not going to be able to do that. Because psychic functioning in general, and remote viewing in particular, is not an analytic task. It's a non-analytic task. You can describe shapes and forms, and especially colors, and often weight and texture and that kind of thing with great ease. But very, very few people are able to read anything. So Ingo Swann, who had been a psychic since he was a child, taught Hal and me how to do remote viewing and how to teach it. And Hal and I then did research for a number of years. We convinced the CIA that they should give us money to support our program. And the deal we made with the devil, which some of you may not approve of, the deal we made is that we would describe the significant threats to national security. This is in the Cold War, remember, this is 1972, where we were still hiding in our fallout shelters. So the deal we made is that we would describe the targets of interest to the CIA and promise that we would not mention their name if they would let us write books and publish papers and talk to our friends about the scientific aspects of what we found. And we dealt with an honorable man, John McMahon, who was the head of intelligence at the CIA, and he's a very smart guy. He said, well, this doesn't make any sense to me, but I like the data that you have, so we will test you. If you're able to do what you're claiming, then we will support your program. So the very first remote viewing that we ever did at SRI was with, the first band we worked with was Ingo Swann, who was a psychic artist, who is still with us, still doing psychic stuff. He's painting in New York City at his loft building in the Bowery. The next person we worked with was a prodigious psychic named Pat Price, who was a psychic police commissioner, and Price volunteered to help us. And what we described for John McMahon, he sent us a CIA agent who gave me geographical coordinates of latitude and longitude and told me to find out what was there. And I turned to Pat Price and said, here are the coordinates, what do you see at this location? And I know that some of you have heard this story before, but it's how we got started. It's part part of my little narrative. And Price described lying on his back psychically on top of a building, and you can do this. He quieted his mind and said, a big crane is rolling back and forth over my body. It's a giant gantry crane. It's got wheels on either side of this building. And he drew this giant crane, 8-wheel crane, and he said, inside this building, they're building a big steel sphere, 60 feet in diameter, welding it together out of orange peel shapes, out of gores. And that's what he drew, and that's what he described. And the crane he drew was exactly correct. As we were able to get confirmation from satellite pictures that he drew the right crane. But unfortunately, Price died the next year, and 2 years later, the Russians rolled this big steel sphere out of the building, and our satellite pictures showed that they were making a containment vessel out of steel for a particle beam weapon to shoot down the satellites that were taking these pictures. So that's what the CIA, we would call that a hit. And based on that, because even in the CIA write-up, they said that this was fabricated out of steel gores being welded together, is the exact words that Price had used 3 years before. So one of the interesting things that we're always worried about some kind of super psi. Maybe he read the final report and didn't look at the thing in real time. It's only a parapsychologist would be worried about that. But we wanted to know, was he really doing what he said he was doing? But in this case, since he died before anybody knew the answer, the evidence is very strong that he really quieted his mind, looked at the place that we wanted him to look at, and described what was there. That experiment was so successful that we were rewarded with a congressional investigation that took us to Washington, where we had to defend our program in the well of the House of Representatives, right where our late great president had to defend his behavior, but we had a good outcome, and the House Intelligence Oversight Committee heard our story. See, they were worried that there had been a security leak, because from the Congress's point of view, you had this crazy story about a bunch of psychics in California revealing secret Soviet data that nobody in the Western world knew. It must be a leak. Must be something the matter with that. But all our friends from the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA defended us, and we were told to press on. We had a successful encounter in the House, and our contract monitor from the CIA took us to lunch in the White House restaurant, gleaming with beautiful silver decanters and polished silver plates. We had wonderful pork roast with hominy grits and black-eyed peas and collard greens, because one of the senators had recently slaughtered a hog, and our reward, I mean, this is Washington, D.C. So when the senator slaughters a hog, everybody eats high on the hog, and we all had pork roast and black-eyed peas for lunch. So the memorable, successful lunch that we had. And we then went on for another 20 years at SRI doing various kinds of psychic things. We found an American General Dozier who was kidnapped by the Red Brigade in Italy, and Joe McMoneagle, who was one of the, see, Ingo taught us, and then we taught 6 people from Army intelligence that we chose as to agree with what the Army intelligence asked us to do. They were uncomfortable with all this information coming from psychics in California. This sounds bad. So they wanted us to teach half a dozen people from Army intelligence who are bona fide soldiers, and they set up a remote viewing facility at Fort Meade, and we taught those people. Those 6 guys then taught the world. So Ingo taught us, we taught the Army, and the Army taught the world, which is why we've got 1 million sites out there. Because what happened is the program's closed down. It was closed down in 19 95, when Robert Gates, who's now Secretary of Defense, had been head of the CIA, Gates decided the Cold War is over in 1995, so America doesn't have any real enemies anymore, so we can get rid of the Psychic Research Corps, Psychic Operations Corps. So we've done things like looking for bin Laden and people like that. Saddam Hussein, so long ago we've forgotten who he is. But we're not tasked to do that. There may be a psychic research program in the basement of the Pentagon, but they haven't asked me about it. So it could be there, but I don't know. But the people in the Army Intelligence Group who had been doing remote viewing for all those years, all retired by 95, and they all went out to teach remote viewing. And the evidence that it's so easy to teach is that these guys would then teach people, and the people they would teach say, well, that wasn't very hard. I could do that. And that's what I once taught at Esalen, one of my favorite places to teach, beautiful Esalen Institute. And Esalen's agreement is that you can sit with a teacher in the first Friday evening, and if you don't like that class, you can go somewhere else. So teachers always try and be exceptionally interesting the first night so you don't lose your students. And I did a remote viewing talk and ended that with a remote viewing exercise where people had to describe the object that I had brought in a bag. And I brought a very unusual object, as I often do. And at the end of that, people would make a drawing. And one of the students, a young woman, got up and had drawn exactly what I had. She made a perfect, artistic young woman, made a perfect drawing and named the thing that I had, which happened to be a statue of Shiva, or in a circle of flames, beautiful big statue of Shiva. And I can mention that because I'm not going to use that anymore. That had been a favorite hot target, and I pulled out my Shiva and said, here it is. And she said, well, that's really pretty interesting. Do you mind if I change to another class where I could actually learn something? And that's the reason you've got a million websites dealing with remote viewing. It's like in medical school, a young doctor sees an operation, does an operation, and teaches one. So the idea of see one, do one, teach one is what's happening in the remote viewing arena. That I've taught remote viewing all over the world now. And my favorite place to teach is in Italy, where the people are exceptionally psychic. And I don't understand that. But I've taught workshops where I have 30 or 40 people in my class, and I end the class with a formal double-blind trial. That is, each person has her own picture in an envelope, unique picture for each person. Their partner interviews them, tell me about the picture, and then the partner has to decide which one of 4 pictures it could be. And nobody knows the answer, and I don't know the answer. And in each of my 5 workshops now in Italy, the group has been independently statistically significant. Now, that may not thrill you, but as a significance junkie as I am, finding that each little workshop I taught in Italy was a publishable, unique, significant thing with odds of 1 in 1,000, I thought was very amazing, because although in places like Omega in New York or East West Bookshop or Esalen, there are always a few people who do very well. I've never had an independent, publishable weekend. I mean, finding a significant weekend means that you can get your PhD. You've done something, the odds are 1 in 1,000, that's really pretty amazing. So the last time I was in Arco in northern Italy, I was talking to a big group. I was talking to the plenary session mainly women come to these things for some reason, and it's because they've got their hemispheres connected, I believe. I know that they have their hemispheres connected. I don't know that that's the reason they're more psychic. But I was asking this sort of an open question. I said, why do you think it is that all of you are more psychic, significantly more psychic, than your American sisters in Silicon Valley? Silicon Valley women are pretty smart, no doubt about it. And see, that was a terrible thing for me to ask. It really put pressure on my group, because they have to perform well. And one of the women stood up and said, well, everybody knows that Italian women are the most beautiful and the most sexy, so why shouldn't we be the most psychic? And I think that there is some truth in that. The reason I'm telling the story is that it corresponds to their ability to totally let go and expect to be successful. And I'm not going to do this is not a workshop, so we're not going to end up with a what do I have in the bag experiment, but I encourage you to incorporate psychic ability in your life with the assumption that it's going to be successful. This is a human ability. I'm not teaching people how to do remote viewing. I'm just giving them permission. And one of the reasons we had such great success at SRI is because we have all the paraphernalia, oscilloscopes and oscillators and machinery and locked up vaults and combination locks and all the prestige of SRI. It's as though SRI is giving you permission to be psychic. So we expect, and people come in with the expectation that this is going to work. And I have often sat across from people at the table at lunch or in a cafe and supported my program by saying, I'd like to see something psychic, says the contract person to me. And I say, okay, I will show you how to do it right now. I'm prepared for this little meeting that we're having. I brought an object for you. Here's a paper napkin and a pen. Quiet your mind and just start drawing. And that's most of the time successful. And I've done that on camera, on television, and that's how we supported our program, right up to the Undersecretary of Defense, Walter LaBerge, came to work Undersecretary of Defense for Carter, came to our lab and said, we've been supporting you for many years now. I'd like to witness one of your experiments. I said, that's fine, we're prepared to do that. Send your major out with Hal Putoff, and we'll do an experiment. And he said, well, who's the psychic? And I said, you are, whatever it is, Your Honor, Your Excellency, your directorship. And he did very, very well. And in my book, I described that, and my wife painted a picture of Allied Arts, which he described superbly. So all of this preamble is to give you an idea, to encourage you to pursue this kind of psychic ability and to incorporate it into your lives.
I want to all through all the psychic stuff. It's real.
Good.
Thank you so much for giving me
Did it make any sense?
Yeah.
No, I just want, Bible doesn't believe that I use perfect language. That was such a long time ago.
What are you doing now?
I'm retired. I'm fighting with real estate.
Well, that's good.
I have two goals. Number one, keep the body